Yeah, many of the changes that are needed to combat climate change will require investment and perhaps incredibly significant investment. There was a report released on Monday that estimated that emerging markets and developing countries will need $2.4 trillion a year in investment to cap their emissions and adapt to the challenges posed by climate change. On the line is Gareth Phillips, who's the manager of the Climate and Environment Finance Division at the Africa Development Bank and is on the line from Dubai. Welcome to Newsday, Gareth. How much money do you think African nations need each year to be able to wean themselves off fossil fuels and also cope with the changing climate?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Indeed, you quoted a figure of $2.4 trillion a year globally. For Africa, our estimate from our own work at the African Development Bank is around $2.8 trillion over the decade. So that's coming out at about $280 billion a year. And just to put that into context, the African Development Bank, which is one of the major lenders on the continent, we lend about $8 billion a year. So you can see there's a very big gap between what we're able to mobilize and what the African continent actually needs.
So what is the prospect then, do you think, that African nations will be able to persuade the investment community and rich nations to stump up this 280 billion a year?
So there are a number of opportunities. There's things like accessing the special drawing rights, which we hope will develop with the IMF.
Just so everyone's clear, that's a kind of currency lodged at the International Monetary Fund.
Correct. Yes, and then of course the main solution we're aiming for is to try to mobilize more funds from institutional investors and the private sector, and we can use blended finance approaches to do this, where we take money from highly concessional sources such as the Green Climate Fund and the development finance institutions, and blend that with cheaper or concessional funding and commercial funding from various sources to be able to put together a package that can offer less expensive loans to developing countries.
And so you are talking about loans here. You're not in any way talking about grants that don't have to be paid back.
So this is a challenge, and we know that many least developed countries are heavily indebted, and we don't want to burden them with additional loans. However, grant money is also relatively scarce. The philanthropies provide grant money, and governments provide a proportion of grant money, and I think more will be needed. But grant money is also difficult to mobilize, and to mobilize grant money from developed countries inevitably means that money has to be raised, and that can potentially mean increases in levies or taxes for developed countries to make that money available. So, for example, in the UK, they're trying to increase, or there's pressure to increase the amount of development finance, but that grant has to come from somewhere. So it's difficult. There will be a component of grant, but we can also make existing loans cheaper. We can give longer tenor. We can also restructure existing debt, particularly using things like the special drawing rights. And there are initiatives around debt for nature swaps that can help us reschedule debt and reduce interest rates as well.
All of which is interesting, but I just wonder what you think the moral obligation is on richer nations to provide grant financing that doesn't have to be repaid to the world's poorest nations, which didn't cause the climate problem.
Yes, I think there's a strong moral obligation to do that. That's a personal view, and that's many of the points, or those are the points that are being discussed here at the COP in Dubai, where governments are being asked to increase their contributions, and there are heavily negotiated decisions being made.
We have spoken in the past few months to different finance ministers from across Africa, for example, Ghana and Zambia, who found themselves in difficulties with their debt over the past couple of years. It's a difficult ask to a population, isn't it, which is suffering some economic pain because of a high level of debt, to say you need to take on even more debt, perhaps pay more taxes to repay that debt in the future so that we can transition away from fossil fuels to reduce a climate problem that we didn't in the main cause.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And so, as I mentioned, there's a number of instruments that we're looking at to try to reduce the burden of existing debt. But I think the important thing is that the Paris Agreement provides a framework where countries have the opportunity to express the support that they need. We have this concept of unconditional contributions, the things that governments say they can do with their existing revenues and existing budgets, and then we identify the conditional activities, which are things that governments say they can do if they get additional support. And the Paris Agreement provides a framework for communicating that message through the long-term strategies, which are the long-term pathways as to how they're going to get to net zero, and then the 5-year nationally determined contributions and the national adaptation plans. And those documents should really provide the detail that identify what support is required, so that then the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, and other donors and philanthropies and corporates can then engage.